Julian campaigns beyond the Rhine. At the end of these various operations, the young favourite of Mars, relieved from anxiety now that peace was restored to the Rhine after the Battle of Strasbourg, and concerned to save the bodies of the slain from being devoured by birds of prey, ordered all to be buried indiscriminately in a common grave. He also set free the envoys who, as I have said, brought him a truculent message before the battle, and returned to Saverne, from which he dispatched the booty and all the prisoners to Metz, to be kept safe against his return. He himself intended to march to Mainz, with the idea of building a bridge, crossing the river, and seeking out the barbarians in their own territory, now that none of them was left in ours. He found himself hindered by the protests of his troops, but his eloquence and the charms of his speech won them over to his will. Their affection was fired by experience of his quality, and made them willing followers of a man who had shared in all their toil, who had shown himself a superb general, and who, it was plain, was in the habit of imposing more hardship on himself than on his men. The appointed place was soon reached, a bridge was built, the river crossed, and the country of the enemy occupied. The barbarians, who supposed themselves to be in perfect safety and free at that moment from all possibility of being molested, were overwhelmed by this great feat. The destruction of others inspired anxious thoughts of what might be in store for themselves, so to avoid the shock of the first onslaught, they pretended to sue for peace and sent envoys to affirm in set terms their intention of abiding by the existing agreement. Afterwards, however, for some unknown reason, they changed their minds and sent a second party in great haste to threaten our troops with war to the death, unless we evacuated their territory. On hearing reliable news of this, the Caesar in the early hours of the night embarked 800 men on small, swift boats with orders to land some distance upstream, and destroy whatever they could find with fire and sword. This was followed at dawn by an advance uphill by our men, who were in good heart. The barbarians had been seen on the heights, but none of them was found there. They had withdrawn at once before the threat of attack, and huge columns of smoke were seen at a distance, which showed that our boat party had penetrated, and was devastating the enemy's country. This stroke broke the Germans' spirit. They abandoned the confined and obscure positions in which they were lying in wait for our troops, and fled across the river Main to bring help to their kinsfolk. Then, as is apt to happen in moments of doubt or confusion, they were thrown into a panic on finding themselves caught between the approach of our cavalry and the onslaught of the boat party. Their knowledge of the terrain enabled them to get away quickly, and our troops, advancing without opposition, ransacked farms rich in livestock and produce. None were spared. Prisoners were taken from the houses, which were carefully built in the Roman fashion, and all were then set on fire and burned to the ground. After an advance of some 10 miles, our men reached a dark and dreary forest, where Julian paused for some time in doubt, because a deserter had informed him that a large force was lurking in some subterranean tunnels and a maze of trenches, ready to burst out at an appropriate moment. Our men, however, had the hardihood to make a resolute approach, only to find the paths blocked with felled oaks and ashes, and a great mass of fir trees. So they withdrew cautiously, scarcely able to contain their anger as they realised that further progress could only be made by a long and rough detour. Besides, they were nipped by the bitter air. The autumn equinox was past, and hill and plain alike in those parts were covered with snow, and further effort involved great risk, to no purpose. So they embarked on a notable work, and without meeting any opposition, enthusiastically took in hand the repair of a fort which Trajan had established in the territory of the Alemanni, and called by his own name, and which had recently been the object of a violent attack. A garrison was stationed there to meet the needs of the moment, and stores accumulated from the very heartland of the barbarians. The enemy, seeing this scheme for their destruction far advanced and greatly fearing the completion of the work, flocked hastily together and sent spokesmen to beg for peace in the most humble terms. This the Caesar, after mature deliberation, found many plausible reasons for granting for the space of 10 months. No doubt it occurred to a man of his keen intelligence that a position which he had occupied unopposed beyond his hopes should be strengthened by catapults on its walls and strong defensive equipment. Relying on this agreement, 3 of the most savage kings from among those who had sent help to the vanquished at Strasbourg came at last, though still in a state of some alarm, to take an oath according to their native ritual, that they would make no disturbance, but would observe the truce up to the appointed day, since that was our will, and leave the fort unmolested. They further undertook to bring supplies of corn on their shoulders if the garrison informed them that there was a shortage, and they kept both these promises, because fear put a check on their treacherous disposition. This notable war, which can stand comparison with the wars against the Carthaginians and Teutons, but which was brought to an end with very slight losses on the Roman side, gave the Caesar cause to rejoice in his success and good fortune. His detractors pretended that the motive for his gallant exploits was that he preferred to fall gloriously in battle, rather than meet a criminal's death like his brother Gallus, which was what he expected. This theory would be plausible if he had not, even after the death of Constantius, persisted in the same course, and added to his reputation by his wonderful achievements. Julian starves 600 marauding Franks into surrender. Things being thus firmly settled as far as circumstances allowed, Julian on his way to his winter quarters found that he had still a toilsome task to perform. The master of cavalry, Severus, on his march to Rheims by way of Cologne and Julias, encountered some strong companies of Frankish skirmishers, who to the number of 600, as later emerged, were laying waste unprotected areas. They were encouraged to this bold action by the fact that the Caesar was busy in the remote haunts of the Alemanni. They supposed therefore that they could carry off a rich haul without opposition. Frightened by the return of the army, they occupied 2 forts which had long been abandoned, and defended themselves as best they could. Julian, disturbed by this unexpected event, and divining what would be its outcome if he passed on without attacking the marauders, halted his troops, and prepared to blockade the strongholds, which were on the banks of the river Meuse. The fixed resolve and incredible obstinacy with which the barbarians defended themselves protracted the siege for 54 days during the months of December and January. Then the Caesar, whose sagacity suggested to him that the barbarians might wait for a moonless night and cross the frozen river, arranged for parties to patrol in light cutters in both directions every night from dusk till dawn, so as to break up the slabs of ice and destroy any chance of an easy escape. This device reduced the defenders, who were worn out by hunger and lack of sleep, to utter despair. They surrendered voluntarily and were immediately sent to the court of the Augustus. A large force of Franks which had set out to rescue them, hearing that they had been carried into captivity, made no further effort and returned home. After this success, the Caesar returned to spend the winter at Paris. Julian attempts to relieve the Gauls from oppressive taxation. Our prudent leader, expecting that a large number of tribes would combine against him in greater strength, had a heavy weight of anxiety to sustain, as he pondered the uncertain chances of war. Though the respite he was enjoying was brief and full of business, he thought that he could do something to alleviate the disastrous losses suffered by the owners of land, and embarked upon a reform of the system of taxation. Florentius, the Praetorian prefect, after what he maintained was a careful review of the figures, declared that he would make up the deficit in the poll tax by a special levy, but Julian, who was knowledgeable about such matters, affirmed that he would rather die than allow this to be done. He knew that the irredeemable damage inflicted by settlements, or to give them a truer name, unsettlements of this kind, had often brought provinces to utter poverty, the very thing that, as will be shown later, completely ruined Illyricum. The Praetorian prefect protested that it was intolerable that he, to whom the Augustus had entrusted supreme responsibility, should suddenly be treated as unreliable, but Julian returned a soft answer, and demonstrated by a detailed and accurate calculation that the product of the taxes was not merely adequate, but even in excess of what was required for necessary public expenditure. Nevertheless, at a much later date, a proposal for a supplementary levy was submitted to him, but he would not read it, or sign it, and threw it on the ground. On receiving a report from the prefect, the Augustus sent a letter warning Julian not to undermine Florentius' credit by his interference, but Julian replied that it was a matter for congratulation if the provincials, after being plundered on all sides, could produce the standard taxes. As for a supplement, even torture could not wring it from men in extreme want. The upshot was that, through the resolution of one man, no attempt was made thereafter to extract from the Gauls anything more than the normal dues. Finally, contrary to all precedent, the Caesar persuaded the prefect to hand over to him the administration of the Second Belgic province, which was suffering from a variety of troubles. He stipulated that no official, either of the prefect or of the governor, should put pressure to pay upon anyone, with the result that all whom he had taken under his wing were so heartened by this relief that they paid what was due before the appointed day without waiting for any demand. Constantius erects an obelisk in the Circus Maximus at Rome. While these first steps were being taken towards the rehabilitation of Gaul, and Orphidius was still serving his second term as urban prefect, an obelisk was set up in the Circus Maximus at Rome, and this seems a suitable moment to give a brief account of it. The city of Egyptian Thebes, founded in remote antiquity and once famous for its imposing walls and its 100 gates, was called by its builders 100-gated Thebes on that account, and has given its name to the province which still at the present day is called the Thebaid. At the time when Carthage was beginning to expand, Thebes was destroyed by Punic commanders in an unexpected assault. Later, after being rebuilt, it was attacked by Cambyses, king of Persia, a monarch who was a monster of greed all his life, and whose object in invading Egypt was to seize the riches which aroused his envy, without sparing even the offerings sacred to the gods. While he was running wildly about among his plundering troops, he tripped in his loose robes and fell on his face. His dagger, which he wore on his right thigh, was shaken from its sheath by the sudden fall, and inflicted on him a wound which was well nigh mortal. Long afterwards, Cornelius Gallus, who was procurator of Egypt in the reign of Octavian, ruined the city by peculation on a large scale. When he returned home, he was put on trial for his thefts and for pillaging the province, and, fearing the fierce indignation of the nobles to whom the emperor had entrusted the investigation of the case, fell on his own sword. This Gallus was, if I am not mistaken, the poet whom Virgil celebrates almost with tears in the polished verses of his last eclogue. In this city, among the huge monuments and colossal statues, in the likeness of the gods of Egypt, I have seen many obelisks, some of them lying in fragments on the ground. They were hewn by early kings out of veins of stone, for which they ransacked mountains at the ends of the earth, and dedicated by them to the gods of heaven, to commemorate the defeat of a foreign race, or some other successful achievement of their reign. An obelisk is a very hard stone in the shape of a turning post in the circus. It rises to a great height, gradually tapering to resemble a sunbeam. Its four sides converge to a narrow point, and are polished by the craftsman's hand. The innumerable characters called hieroglyphs, which we see inscribed on every face, owe their form to tradition handed down from the sages of early times. By carving many kinds of birds and beasts, some even of a different world from this, men left a record of the vows which the kings promised or performed in order that the memory of their exploits might be widely preserved among generations to come. The writing of the early Egyptians is not like ours, in which a fixed and simple series of letters expresses all the ideas of the human mind. For them, a single character served to signify a single substantive or verb, or sometimes, indeed, a complete sentence. Two examples will serve for the moment to illustrate this. The word nature is represented by a vulture because natural historians report that no males are to be found among these birds, and they use the symbol of a bee, making honey to signify king, indicating in this way that in a ruler's nature sweetness should be combined with a sting, and so on. The flatterers whose habit it was to inflate the pride of Constantius kept dinning into his ears that the Emperor Octavian, who brought 2 Egyptian obelisks from Hierapolis, and set up one in the Circus Maximus, and the other in the Campus Martius, did not dare to disturb or move the one which was brought to Rome in our day, because he was daunted by the difficulties presented by its size. But let me tell those who do not know, that the reason why that early emperor left the obelisk untouched, when he moved some others, was that it was dedicated to a special offering to the sun god, and placed in the sacred precinct of a magnificent temple, to which access was forbidden. Constantine, however, made small account of this, and rightly supposed that he would be committing no sacrilege if he removed this wonderful object from one temple and dedicated it at Rome, which may be called the temple of the whole world. So he tore it from its foundations, but then let it lie for a long period on the ground, while the necessary preparations were being made for its transport. It was brought down the Nile by water and landed at Alexandria, where a ship of unheard-of size, requiring 300 rowers, was built for it. After this preliminary work, the emperor in question died, and enthusiasm for the enterprise dwindled. At last, however, the obelisk was embarked and conveyed overseas and up the Tiber, which might well fear that its estuary would prove unequal to the task of bringing to the walls of the city it had nurtured this gift from the Nile it hardly knew. The obelisk was landed at Vicus Alexandri, 3 miles below the city. There it was placed on a sledge, slowly dragged through the Ostian Gate, and the Piscina Publica, and brought into the Circus Maximus. It only remained to set it upright, a task which seemed almost if not totally impossible. Dangerously tall masts were erected, which gave the impression of a forest of beams. To these were attached long stout ropes, which formed a network so dense that it hid the sky. The mountain of obelisk, covered with inscribed figures, was tied to the ropes and gradually hauled up through the empty air, where it hung suspended for a long time, till at last the efforts by many thousands of men, turning what looked like millstones, placed it in position in the middle of the circus. It was surmounted by a bronze sphere gleaming with gold leaf, but this was at once struck by lightning and destroyed. It was replaced by the bronze replica of a torch, also covered in gold, which shines like a sheet of flame. Successive generations have brought other obelisks to Rome, of which one was set up on the Vatican, another in the gardens of Sallust, and 2 more before the mausoleum of Augustus. Fruitless negotiations between Constantius and Sapor by letters and envoys, AD 358. In the consulship of Dartianus and Cerelis, while the whole administration of Gaul was being conducted with vigour tempered by caution, and the memory of past reverses kept raids by the barbarians in check, the Persian king Sapor was still engaged with the peoples on his furthest borders. He had concluded a treaty of alliance with the Chionetae and Galani, the fiercest fighters of all, and was about to return to his capital, when he received the letter from Tamsapor, which contained the news that the Roman Emperor was begging for peace. Believing that such a proposal must be a sign that the strength of the empire was impaired, Sapor opened his mouth wider, and while accepting peace in principle, accompanied it with harsh conditions. He sent a certain Narses to convey presents and a letter to Constantius. The tenor of this, which showed no abatement of his native arrogance, I understand to have been as follows. From Sapor, King of Kings, partner of the stars, brother of the sun and moon, to my brother Constantius Caesar, greetings. I rejoice and am well pleased that you have at last returned to the right way and acknowledge what perfect justice requires, having learned by experience what disasters have often resulted from an obstinate greed for the possessions of others. Since therefore the language of truth should be uninhibited and free, and it becomes those in high places to speak as they feel, I shall express my intention succinctly, remembering that I have often repeated in the past what I am about to say. That the rule of my ancestors once extended to the Strymon and the borders of Macedonia is a fact to which even your ancient records bear witness, and it is right that I should demand this territory, since, with due modesty be it spoken, my splendour and the catalogue of my illustrious qualities surpass those of the kings of old. But the rule of right is ever dear to me. I have been wedded to it from my youth up, and have never committed an action which I have had cause to repent. So now I owe it to myself to recover Armenia and Mesopotamia, of which my grandfather was deprived by deliberate deceit. Never will I accept the principle which your overweening pride leads you to enunciate, that all is fair in war that brings success, whether it be achieved by fraud or force. In a word, if you will be guided by good advice, let go this small area, which has always been a source of trouble and bloodshed, and reign in peace over the rest of your realm. Have the wisdom to reflect that those who practice medicine sometimes cauterize and cut, and even amputate parts of the body, in order that the patient may enjoy the healthy use of the rest. Even some animals do the same. When they realize what it is that makes men eager to capture them, they abandon it spontaneously, in order to live thereafter free from fear. This I emphatically declare, that if my envoys return empty-handed, I shall at the end of winter mobilize all of my forces and advance as far as prudence permits, relying for success on fortune and the justice of what I propose. To this letter the Emperor, after long deliberation, sent in plain terms, as they say, the following considered reply. From Constantius, victor on land and sea, perpetual Augustus, to his brother, King Sapor, greetings. I am glad to hear of your well-being, and am ready, if you wish, to be your friend, but I strongly reprobate your greed, which never abates, and is always spreading over a wider area. You lay claim to Mesopotamia and Armenia as well, and you advise me to lop off some members of a sound body to ensure its health hereafter. I must totally reject such a suggestion, which can never win my assent. Listen then to the plain unvarnished truth, which is not to be shaken by empty threats. My praetorian prefect, believing that he was acting in the public interest, used 2 insignificant intermediaries to enter into negotiations for peace with your general. He did not consult me. We do not disown or repudiate his initiative, provided that it is consistent with dignity and honour, and involves no breach of the respect due to our majesty. For us, at a time when a series of various achievements had shed glory on us, may no jealousy be offended by this. When the usurpers have been destroyed and the whole Roman world is at our feet, it would be absurd and foolish to abandon possessions which we long held intact, even when we were confined within the narrow limits of the East. Let there be an end, pray, to the threats which it is your habit to launch at us. It is beyond all doubt that it is self-restraint, not lack of spirit, which has sometimes led us to accept rather than provoke battle, and to defend our territory, whenever we are attacked, with courage inspired by a clear conscience. Both experience and reading have taught us that, though Rome has on a few rare occasions suffered a reverse in a particular battle, it has never emerged the loser from an entire war. The mission was dismissed empty-handed, since no further response was possible to the unbridled greed of the king, but in a very few days it was followed by Count Prosper, accompanied by Spectatus, a notary who held the rank of tribune, and at the suggestion of Musonian, the philosopher Eustathius, a master of the art of persuasion. They carried a letter and gifts from the emperor, and their task was to secure by diplomacy a delay in Sapor's preparations, while our northern provinces were being fortified beyond the possibility of an attack. Barbatio repels an attack of the Juthungi on Raetia. In the midst of these uncertainties, the Juthungi, a branch of the Alemanni whose territory bordered upon the prefecture of Italy, broke the treaty of peace which had been granted in response to their prayers, and made a violent inroad into the Raetian provinces, even going so far beyond their habit as to besiege fortified towns. Barbatio, who had been promoted master of infantry in the place of Silvanus, was sent with a strong force to repel them. He was a coward but a ready speaker. Kindling the enthusiasm of his troops, he inflicted a disastrous defeat on the foe. Their losses were such that only a handful who took to flight in panic escaped with their lives and got back to their homes, full of weeping and wailing. Navita, who was afterwards consul, is said to have taken part in this battle in command of a troop of cavalry, and to have done it valiantly. Nicomedia is destroyed by an earthquake. At the same period, there were terrible earthquakes in Macedonia, Asia, and Pontus, which shook many towns and mountains with repeated shocks. Among all these various catastrophes, the destruction of Nicomedia, the metropolis of Bithynia, stood out, and I will give a brief and truthful account of the calamity which occurred there. At dawn on the 24th of August, the sky, which a short time before had been brilliantly clear, was covered by thick masses of black cloud. The sun's light was blotted out, and visibility became so bad that even the nearest objects disappeared, and a dense and dirty fog spread itself over the ground. Then, as if God Most High were hurtling his fatal thunderbolts and summoning the winds from the four quarters of the sky, squalls of immense violence ensued, at the impact of which groans from the mountains and crashing from the smitten shore were audible. There followed whirlwinds and waterspouts, accompanied by a terrifying earthquake, which entirely overset the city and its environs. Since most of the houses were built on slopes, they fell on top of one another, and the whole air rang with the prodigious noise of their fall. The hilltops echoed the various cries of people searching for their wives and children, and others close to them. At last, shortly after the second hour, the day, which was now bright and clear, revealed the full extent of the carnage. Some had perished under the sheer weight of the debris which had fallen on them. Some were buried up to their neck in heaps of rubble and died for lack of assistance, when they might have survived had there been anybody to help them out. Others hung transfixed on the sharp points of projecting timbers. The majority died at a single stroke, and where a moment before had been human beings, nothing was to be seen but heaps of jumbled corpses. Some were imprisoned unhurt by the fallen roofs of their houses to await an agonizing death from starvation. This was the lot of Aristentius, who breathed his last after protracted suffering. He was governor of the recently created diocese which Constantius entitled Pietas in honour of his wife, Eusebia. Others who were crushed by the sudden overwhelming shock lie buried to this day under the same ruins. Some whose skulls had been fractured or who had lost arms or legs, however, hovered between life and death, and were abandoned in spite of their loud cries for help from others who were in the same plight. The greater part of the buildings, both public and private, and of the inhabitants, might have been saved, had not a sudden outbreak of fire, which spread for 5 days and nights, burned up everything that could be consumed. Campaign of Julian against the Franks. The Caesar wintering in Paris was at pains to forestall any move by the Alemanni, who were not yet collected in one body, but whose boldness and ferocity after their defeat at Strasbourg approached the point of madness. While he waited for the month of July, which marks the opening of the campaign season in Gaul, Julian was a prey to long anxiety. He could not take the field till midsummer, when the frost and cold were succeeded, and he was allowed to replenish his supplies from Aquitaine. But careful thought overcomes nearly all difficulties. After turning over various plans, he decided that the only course was not to wait for high summer, but to encounter the barbarians before he was expected. Once this was settled, he took rations for 20 days from the meal kept for consumption in the standing camp. baked it to ensure that it would keep, and loaded it in the form commonly known as a biscuit on the back of his men, who were willing enough to carry it. Relying on this provision, he set out with favourable auspices as before, in the belief that 5 or 6 months would suffice to complete 2 urgent and necessary campaigns. His first objective was the Franks, those specifically who are usually called Saeli. They had had the temerity in the past to settle themselves on Roman soil at Toxiandria. When he arrived at Tongres, he was met by a deputation from this people, who supposed that they would find him still in winter quarters. They offered peace on condition that they should be left undisturbed and unmolested in what they regarded as their own territory, provided that they gave no trouble. After fully considering the matter, Julian suggested some complicated conditions and sent them away with gifts. They were under the impression that he would remain in the same area until their return, but once they had gone, he followed them in a flash, and sending his general Severus along the river, fell suddenly on the whole body, and smote them like a thunderbolt. Instead of resisting, they fell to entreaties, so using his victory as a favourable opportunity to show mercy, he accepted their surrender with their goods and families. A like fate befell the Chamavi, who had dared to behave in a similar way. Julian fell on them with the same speed. Some were slain, some were taken alive after a stout resistance and put in irons. Others who took to headlong flight were allowed to reach their homes unharmed in order to save the troops the labour of a long pursuit. Soon afterwards they sent envoys to petition on their behalf and to represent their interests. They prostrated themselves in Julian's presence and were granted peace and permission to return home in safety. Julian on the Meuse. Since everything was going his way, Julian, who was always on the watch for any opportunity to place the security of the provinces on a firmer basis, decided in the circumstances to repair 3 forts erected in a straight line overlooking the Meuse, which had been destroyed some time before by a determined barbarian attack. This was immediately effected, although it involved a short intermission of the campaign. To ensure the success of this wise plan by rapid action, he took part of the 17 days' rations which the troops carried on their backs when they set out, and used it to provision those forts, believing that the deficiency could be made up from the troops if they harvested the crops of the Chamavi. But this proved a serious miscalculation, as the crops were not yet ripe, and when the troops had used up what they had with them, and could find nothing to eat anywhere, they resorted to the direst threats, and heaped insults and abuse upon Julian, calling him a degenerate Greek from Asia, and a liar and a fool, who pretended to be wise. In any body of troops there are always some remarkably ready talkers, and these made many noisy protests to the following effect. "Where are you taking us, now that we have lost all hope of seeing better times? For a long while we have put up with all the hardships of snow and cruel biting frosts, and now shame upon you, when the final destruction of the enemy is within our grasp. We are wasting away from hunger, the most ignominious of all deaths. Do not think us mutineers. Our only object is to preserve our lives. We do not ask for gold or silver, which we have not touched or even seen for a long while. One might think from the way in which they have been kept from us that we were guilty of encountering all this toil and danger in order to injure our country." They had good cause to complain, From the day when Julian arrived, through all the course of their meritorious service in dangerous and critical times, the troops, though worn out by their labours in Gaul, had received neither pay nor gratuity, because Julian had no means whatsoever to pay them, and Constantius would not authorise the normal expenditure from public funds. That this policy was inspired by malice rather than meanness is shown by the fact that when the Caesar gave a small coin to a common soldier who asked, as they often do, for money for a shave, he was assailed with insults and slander by Gaudientius, who was then a notary. This Gaudientius remained in Gaul for a long time to spy on Julian's conduct, and was afterwards put to death at his order, as I shall relate in its proper place. Julian grants peace to the Alemannic kings Salmar and Hortar. At length, order was restored by soft words, and the Rhine was crossed by a bridge of boats. But when they set foot on the territory of the Alemanni, the master of cavalry, Severus, who had hitherto shown himself a spirited and active officer, suddenly lost his nerve. The man who had so often encouraged all and sundry to deeds of valour now argued against battle, and showed himself a despicable coward. Perhaps he had a premonition of approaching death. We read in the books of Tages and Vego that people who are soon to be struck by lightning fall into such apathy that they cannot hear the thunder or other loud noises. Severus' march was so uncharacteristically sluggish that he even threatened to kill his guides, who were advancing at a good speed, if they did not unanimously declare that they were totally ignorant of the locality. Intimidated by this prohibition from their commander, they made no further progress in any direction. While things were at a standstill, Suma, a king of the Alemanni, unexpectedly presented himself together with his men. In the past he had been on fire to inflict loss on the Romans, but now he thought that to be allowed to keep what was his own was an advantage for which he could hardly hope. His expression and bearing were those of a supplicant, so he was kindly received and told to take heart and set his mind at rest. He entirely surrendered his independence and begged for peace on bended knee. This was granted together with an amnesty on condition that he handed over his prisoners and undertook to provide food for the troops whenever they needed it. He was to take receipts like a common contractor for whatever he supplied, and he was told that if he could not produce them on demand, he would be liable again to the same requisition. Once this matter had been properly settled without any difficulty, the next objective was the country of another king called Hortar. To reach this nothing was lacking but guides. The Caesar ordered Nestica, tribune of the Scutari, and Charito, a man of astonishing courage, to use their best endeavours to find and bring him a prisoner. No time was lost in seizing and sending to Julian a young Alemanni, who promised that he would act as a guide if his life were spared. He was able to lead the way, and the troops followed, but they found the direct route blocked by a barrier built of tall trees. Finally, however, they reached their goal by a long and winding detour, but our men were so enraged that they burned up the fields, carried off men and beasts, and cut to pieces without mercy any who offered resistance. The king was shattered by this disaster. The spectacle of dissolution presented by the burnt villages of his land convinced him that he was on the verge of total ruin, so he too begged for pardon, and bound himself with an oath to obey Julian's orders, and give back all the prisoners. Julian was particularly anxious for their release. The king, however, kept back most of them and surrendered only a few. When he heard of this, Julian, who was justly indignant, and, when the king came to receive presents in the customary way, he would not release the 4 vassals on whose support and loyalty Hortar chiefly relied, until all the prisoners were returned. When at last he was summoned to an interview with the Caesar, Hortar prostrated himself before him with fear in his eyes, and was so overcome by the sight of his conqueror that he anticipated the harsh terms imposed on him. These were that, since after so many successes it was only fitting that the towns destroyed by the barbarians should be rebuilt, Horta should provide wagons and materials for this from the resources of himself and his subjects, after promising to do so and invoking on his own head the punishment of death if he should be guilty of the least treachery. He was allowed to return to his own country. He could not be compelled to furnish corn like Salmar, because his lands had been so totally devastated that nothing could be found for him to provide. Thus those kings, once inordinately swollen with pride, who had been in the habit of enriching themselves by plundering our people, bowed their necks to the Roman yoke, and obeyed the imperial commands without a murmur, as if they had been born and brought up among prayers of tribute. At the conclusion of this affair the troops were dispersed to their usual posts, and the Caesar returned to winter quarters. Julian's success is deprecated at court. When news of these events reached the court of Constantius, to whom the Caesar, like any other subordinate, was bound to submit a report of all his doings, all the most influential courtiers, past masters in the art of flattery, made fun of his well-conceived plans, and the success which had attended them. Endless silly jokes were bandied about, such as, "He is more of a goat than a man," an allusion to his wearing a beard, and "His victories are becoming a boar," "Babbling mole," "Ape in purple," "Greek dilettante," and other such names were applied to him, and by ringing the charges on these in the ears of the emperor, who was eager to hear this kind of talk, his enemies attempted to smother his good qualities under their shameless words. They attacked him as slack and timid and sedentary, and accused him of dressing up his reverses in fine language. This was not the first example of such treatment. The most glorious actions are always the target of envy, and we read that in old times too malice invented, if it could not detect, faults and crimes in the greatest captains, who had given offence by the brilliance of their exploits. Simon, son of Miltiades, for example, who after many other successes destroyed a countless host of Persians at the battle of the river Eurymedon in Pamphylia, and compelled the haughty people to sue humbly for peace, was accused of drunkenness. In the same way, Scipio Ammianus, whose unerring alertness brought about the destruction of two powerful cities bent on the ruin of Rome, was represented by his jealous rivals as a sleepyhead. Pompey's detractors also, whose malevolent scrutiny could find nothing in him to deserve blame, finally hit upon two ridiculous and trivial traits. One was his ingrained habit of scratching his head with one finger, the other that for a time he wore a white bandage upon his leg to hide an ugly ulcer. The first was said to be an effeminate gesture, the second a sign that he was intent on a revolutionary coup. It made no difference, they averred, on what part of his body he wore the emblem of royal dignity. Such was the futile argument employed by those who barked at the heels of a man whom we have the clearest proof to have had no equal as a hero and a patriot. During these events, Artemius, the vice-prefect at Rome, also discharged the functions of Bassus, who died a natural death shortly after being promoted to urban prefect. His administration was marked by some violent disturbances, but nothing occurred in it which is worth reporting. Successful campaigns of Constantius on the Danube against the Sarmatians and Quadi. Meanwhile, the Augustus was spending the winter at Sirmium, where he received from a succession of reports the serious news that the Sarmatians and Quadi, who were on good terms with one another, because they were neighbours with a similar way of life and similar weapons, had joined forces and were making raids in detached bands into the Pannonias and Upper Moesia. These people, whose habits are more suited to brigandage than to open warfare, use long spears and breastplates made of pieces of polished horn, attached like scales to a linen backing. Their horses are usually gelded to prevent their bolting in excitement if they see a mare, or plunging wildly when they are placed in ambush and braying their riders by repeated whinnying. They cover enormous distances, either in pursuit or in flight, riding horses that are swift and tractable, and each leading another beast, and sometimes two, so as to maintain the strength of their mounts by changing them and recruiting their energies by alternative periods of rest. So, after the spring equinox, the emperor collected a strong force and took the field with good prospects of success. The river Danube was in flood, owing to the melting of the snows, but Constantius crossed it at the most suitable spot on a bridge of boats, and set about ravaging the territory of the barbarians. The speed of his march took them by surprise. They had not supposed that a hostile force could be mobilized so early in the year. When they saw it at their throats, they did not dare to draw breath or make a stand, but dispersed in flight to avoid a destruction they had not foreseen. A large number were dispatched because fear kept them rooted to the spot. Those who saved their lives by their speed hid themselves in obscure recesses of the mountains and watched the devastation of their country by the sword, when they might have rescued it if they had resisted as vigorously as they ran away. These events took place in that part of Sarmatia which faces the second province of Pannonia, while on the borders of Valeria also the lands of the barbarians were laid waste by a hurricane attack, in which our troops showed the same courage and burned and despoiled all that lay in their path. The Sarmatians, overwhelmed by this prodigious disaster, abandoned their policy of concealment, and formed themselves into 3 parties to attack our men, under pretence of suing for peace, so that they would have no chance of getting their weapons in order, or avoiding wounds, or even taking to flight, which is the last recourse of a desperate situation. The Quadi, moreover, who had often been their inseparable partners in crime, came at once to share the perils of the Sarmatians. But even their ready courage availed nothing, as they threw themselves into a situation of manifest danger. Many were killed, and those who survived made off by hill paths with which they were familiar. Our men, whose morale was raised by this success, adopted a closer formation and advanced rapidly towards the realm of the Quadi, who, taught by their recent disaster to dread what lay in store for them, decided to beg humbly for peace. They believed that they could approach the emperor with confidence because he was inclined to be lenient in cases such as theirs. On the day appointed for settling the terms, Zizais, a fine young man, who was already of royal rank, drew up the Sarmatians in battle order to present their petition, and at the sight of the emperor threw away his weapons, flung himself prostrate on the ground, and lay lifeless. He aroused great pity because at the moment when he should have spoken, fear choked his utterances. After several attempts, interrupted by sobs, he was hardly able to set forth his requests. At last he recovered himself and was told to rise. Kneeling and with his voice once more under control, he begged forgiveness and pardon for his past offences. The multitude of his followers who were admitted to join in his petition remained dumb from fear, as long as the fate of their superior hung in the balance, but when he was told to stand up and gave them the long-awaited signal to add their entreaties to his, they all threw down their shields and spears and stretched out their arms in supplication, striving to outdo even their prince in the humility of their appeal. The latter had brought with him among the rest of the Sarmatians the vassal kings Rumo, Xenifer, and Fragildus, and a number of notables, who hoped to be successful in a similar petition. Overjoyed that their lives were spared, they promised to atone for their acts of hostility by accepting harsh terms, and would gladly have put their own persons, together with their property, their wives and children, and the whole extent of their lands at the disposal of the Romans. Justice, however, was tempered with mercy. They were told to keep their homes and fear nothing. So they gave up their prisoners, brought the hostages that were demanded of them, and promised prompt obedience to all future orders. Encouraged by this instance of clemency, a prince called Arahar hurried to submit with all his men, and with him Usifer, a prominent noble. Both commanded forces of their countrymen, Arahar part of the Trans-Iogitani and Quadi, and Usifer some of the Sarmatians, peoples bound in close union by neighbourhood and warlike spirit. The emperor kept the mass of their people at a distance for fear that they might suddenly rush to arms under pretence of concluding an agreement. He also separated the partners and gave orders that the Sarmatian representatives should withdraw for a time while the case of Arahar and the Quadi was being considered. The latter presented themselves and stood with bowed heads like criminals unable to justify their grave offences. Fearing that they might suffer the supreme penalty, they handed over the hostages that were demanded, a guarantee of good faith that they had never before been forced to give. While their case had been fairly and justly dealt with, Usifer was admitted to plead, though Arahar strongly protested, claiming that the terms which he had obtained should extend also to Usifer, who was his partner, though of inferior rank and accustomed to obey his orders. But after a discussion it was decided that the Sarmatians should be freed from an alien yoke, on the grounds that they had always been dependents of Rome, and they gladly accepted the obligation to give hostages as a bond for keeping the peace. There followed a great influx of parties from native tribes with their kings, who, hearing that Arahar had got off unpunished, begged that the sword might be removed from their throats as well. They too obtained the peace which they asked on similar terms, and brought sooner than was expected the sons of notables from the interior of their country to be handed over as hostages, together with their Roman prisoners. The surrender of these had been stipulated, and they parted from them with as much grief as from their own kindred. When this was settled, the emperor turned his attention to the Sarmatians, who were more to be pitied than hated. The benefit which they gained on this occasion passes belief, and serves to justify the opinion of those who think that fate can be either defeated or determined by the power of a prince. The natives of this realm had once been powerful and renowned, but a secret conspiracy led to an armed uprising of their slaves, and since with barbarians might is always right, the masters were overcome by the slaves, who were their equals in courage, and their superior in numbers. The losers, whose judgment was impaired by panic, took refuge with a distant tribe called the Victohali, believing that in their sad plight submission to those who would protect them was preferable to slavery to slaves. Now they deplored their situation, and having obtained pardon and protection from us, asked for a guarantee of their freedom. The emperor was moved by their hard fate, and calling them together and addressing them in mild terms in the presence of the whole army, bade them yield obedience to none but himself and the generals of Rome. Further, to give additional weight to the restoration of their freedom, he appointed Zizais their king. Even at that period, Zizi's was fitted to sustain the honours of a lofty station, and subsequent events showed him to be a man of his word. But no one was allowed to depart after this glorious outcome until our prisoners were returned in accordance with the stipulation. After these operations on barbarian soil, the camp was moved to Brigetio, in order that there too the embers of the war against the Quadi, who were still active in those parts, should be quenched in the blood or tears of the Quadi. Their prince, Vitrodorus, son of King Vidor, a subordinate chief called Agilimund, and other notables and judges who held sway over various tribes, once they saw our army in the heart of their native land, threw themselves at the feet of our troops, were pardoned, and carried out the orders they were given. They handed over their children as pledges for the performance of the conditions imposed on them, and drawing their swords, which to them are objects of religious reverence, swore that they would remain loyal. Constantius forces the Limigantes to emigrate. When these affairs had been brought to a successful conclusion, as I have reported, the interests of the state required the immediate transfer of our forces to deal with the Limigantes, the former slaves of the Sarmatians, who it would have been a disgrace to leave unpunished for all the outrages they had committed. When the free Sarmatians broke their bounds, the ex-slaves too, in apparent forgetfulness of the past, seized the opportunity thus presented to violate the Roman frontier, and joined forces for once in this treacherous attack with those who were both their masters and their enemies. Nevertheless, a decision was taken to inflict on them a milder punishment than the gravity of their offences merited, and to go no further than to transplant them to a distant region where they would be unable to molest our territory. But the consciousness of the crimes which they had committed over a long period made them fearful of danger. Believing that the weight of our offensive was about to be directed against them, they prepared to meet it with a mixture of fraud, force, and entreaty. The first appearance of our army, however, struck them like a thunderbolt. Fearing the worst, they begged for their lives and promised annual tribute, a levy of their able-bodied men, and a supply of slaves. But their gestures and looks showed that they would refuse to migrate elsewhere if they were ordered to do so, because they relied on the natural strength of the region in which they had settled in safety after the expulsion of their masters. This tract is watered by the Parthyscus in a winding course before it falls into the Danube. While it flows alone and unconfined, it travels slowly through a long, broad plain, but near its mouth this is narrowed so that those who dwell there are protected by the Danube from the Romans and by the barrier of the Parthyscus itself from barbarian inroads. The ground besides is mostly marshy and flooded by the rivers when they rise, and being full of bogs and overgrown with osiers, cannot be crossed without local knowledge. Moreover, there is an island near that confluence of the Parthyscus and the Danube, which the larger river winds round and separates from the land. At the insistence of the emperor, the Limigantes crossed in all their native pride to our bank of the river, with no intention, as the event proved, of doing what they were told, but in order to avoid any appearance of being afraid of our troops. There they stood truculently, letting it be seen that their purpose in coming near was to reject any orders that they might be given. The emperor, who was aware of this possibility, had secretly divided his forces into a number of detachments, and by a swift manoeuvre encircled the stationary barbarians in a ring of his own troops. Then, taking his place with a few attendants on a raised mound, protected by his guards, he warned them in mild terms not to behave with violence. They wavered in a state of indecision between two opposite courses. Rage was tempered by cunning, and they sought to disguise their hostile intentions under a show of entreaty. Intending to attack our men at close quarters, they purposely threw down their shields some way in front of them. This gave them an opportunity to advance gradually to recover them, and so gain ground without betraying their treacherous plan. When evening was coming on, and the waning light made further delay inadvisable, our men raised their standards and launched a fiery assault. The enemy packed closely together, concentrated their attack on the Emperor himself, and menaced him with savage looks and shouts where he stood, as I said, on a higher level. This mad behaviour was too much for the temper of our men. While the barbarians were fiercely threatening the Emperor, the troops adopted a wedge formation, which is known in common soldiers' parlance as a pig's head, and scattered the foe by a furious charge. On the right, our infantry cut to pieces their warriors on foot, while on the left, our cavalry engaged their agile horsemen. The Praetorian cohort, whose task was to protect the person of the Augustus from attack, struck at the enemy's breasts while they resisted, and then at their backs as they fled. The barbarians fell with their spirit unbroken, and showed by their fearful yells that death caused them less anguish than the triumph of our troops. In addition to the dead, many lay hamstrung and were thus prevented from taking refuge in flight. Others lost their right hands. Some were unwounded, but crushed by the weight of falling bodies. All bore their sufferings in deep silence. In all these various agonies no one asked for mercy or threw away his sword or begged to be put out of his misery. Shattered though they were, they clung grimly to their weapons, considering it less of a disgrace to be vanquished by the strength of others than to suffer the reproaches of their own conscience. Occasionally they were heard to complain that what had happened was sheer misfortune and not what they deserved. So in the course of half an hour the outcome of the fight was decided, and so many barbarians fell in a moment, that nothing but the signs of victory showed that there had been a battle. No sooner had the hostile tribes been overthrown than the families of the slain were dragged forth in droves from their humble huts, without distinction of age or sex, to exchange the proud independence of their former life for the degraded status of slaves. A brief space of time served to reveal piles of corpses and throngs of prisoners. So excited by the heat of battle and the prospect of loot, our men betook themselves to the destruction of those who had fled from the fight, or were lying concealed in their huts. Thirsting for barbarian blood, they tore down the frail thatch and slaughtered those within. Even a house built of the strongest timbers could not preserve its inmates from death. At last, when everything was on fire and there was nowhere left to hide, the survivors, finding every avenue of escape cut off, either refused to yield or perished in the flames, or else came out and escaped one form of torment, only to fall at the hands of their enemies. Some, however, escaped the sword and the raging fire and entrusted themselves to the depths of the rivers nearby, hoping to reach the further bank because they could swim. Some of these died by drowning, others were pierced by missiles and perished. So much blood was spilt that the whole stream foamed with it. Thus, with the help of two elements, the rage and courage of the victors destroyed the Sarmatians. After this, it was decided to deprive them all of any prospect of relief. So when their homes had been burned and their families carried off, orders were given to collect boats to hunt down those who were protected from our army by being on the further bank. The keenness of our men was given no time to cool. Light-armed troops were at once embarked in skiffs and, taking a course out of sight of the enemy, seized the hideouts of the Sarmatians, who were deceived at first by the familiar appearance of the native boats that suddenly appeared. But when the gleam of arms revealed that what they feared was upon them, they took refuge in marshy country, into which they were hotly pursued by our troops. Many were killed, and a victory was won in a spot where it was believed impossible to keep one's footing, or undertake any bold exploit. After the dispersal and almost total destruction of the Ammianus, no time was lost in attacking the Picenses, who took their name from the adjacent region. The persistent rumours of the disasters which had overtaken their allies had put them on their guard. It was a difficult business to pursue their scattered bands, and our men were hampered by ignorance of the terrain. So the Typhali and the Free Sarmatians were called upon to help in putting them down. Since the nature of the country necessitated a division of forces, our troops chose to operate in the region bordering on Moesia, while the Typhali dealt with the country nearest their own homes, and the Free Sarmatians occupied the lands immediately opposite them. The Limigantes, terrified by what had befallen those who had been defeated and killed, could not decide for some time whether to seek death or beg for terms. There were weighty precedents for following either course, but at last the influence of a meeting of elders prevailed, and they resolved to surrender. The laurels of our various victories were augmented by the submission of men who had taken up arms to usurp their freedom, and the survivors among them, who had looked on their masters with contempt as beaten weaklings, bowed their heads in entreaty before superior force. So, under a safe conduct, the greater part of them abandoned their mountain fastness and flocked to the Roman camp, spreading over the broad plain with their parents and children and wives, and whatever poor possessions the circumstances of their hasty flight allowed them to huddle together. Men who, as long as they mistook mad recklessness for freedom, one thought would rather have died than change their place of abode, now consented to obey orders and to remove to new homes, whose peace and security could not be troubled by wars or affected by rebellions. The conditions imposed were thought to have their full assent, and they remained quiet for a short time, but later their inborn wildness roused them to commit a fatal crime, as I shall relate in the appropriate place. By the happy outcome of these events, the defences of Illyricum were adequately reinforced in two ways, and the Emperor brought to a successful end both the great tasks to which he had addressed himself. The disloyal Sarmatians were crushed, and the exiles, who were equally fickle, but seemed likely to behave with rather more respect, were at last brought back and re-established in their ancestral domains. And as a crowning mercy, Constantius set over them a king, who was not of low birth, but the very prince whom they had previously chosen for themselves, a man of outstanding gifts of mind and body. After such a series of successes, Constantius put all his fears behind him, and for the second time was greeted by the troops as Sarmaticus, after his defeated foes. Shortly before his departure from the front, he assembled all the cohorts, centuries, and maniples, and standing on a raised platform surrounded by standards and eagles, and a numerous suite of high-ranking officers, he addressed his army, which received him, as usual, with universal applause. The thought of our glorious success, the sweetest pleasure brave men can enjoy, prompts me to rehearse, so far as modesty permits, the changes for the better which, by the will of heaven, which has given us the victory, we have brought about by our loyal defence of the Roman state, both before the fighting and in the very heat of battle. What can be so honourable or so deserving of transmission to the memory of posterity as the exultation of a soldier in the success of his exertions and of a commander in the prudence of his plans? Illyricum was being overrun by the fury of our foes, whose foolish pride led them to think meanly of us while we were away defending Italy and Gaul. In a number of raids they devastated our furthest frontiers, crossing the rivers sometimes in dug-out canoes and sometimes on foot. They did not pin their hopes on pitched battles to be won by force of arms, but on their usual surprise attacks, in which their cunning and versatility had made them formidable to our forebears from the earliest infancy of their race. Because we were at a distance, we put up with this as long as we could, believing that comparatively slight losses could be checked by the activity of our generals, but when impunity encouraged them to further excesses, with frequent disastrous effects upon our provinces, we fortified the approaches of Rhaetia, took most careful measures to place the security of Gaul on a firm footing, and leaving nothing in our rear to cause alarm, advanced into Pannonia, intending, if it pleased the Almighty, to redress a dangerous situation. Setting out fully prepared, as you know, in the middle of spring, we embarked on the massive task which awaited us. Our first objective was to prevent the construction of an extempore bridge being frustrated by a storm of missiles. This caused us no difficulty. We saw and set foot on the enemy's soil, and though the Sarmatians tried to resist to the death, we overthrew them without loss to ourselves, and crushed the Quadi as well, who came to the help of the Sarmatians and showed equal audacity in attacking our glorious legions. The grievous losses which they experienced in their raids and in their breathless attempts to offer a defiant resistance taught them what our valour could do. They threw away their weapons, put behind their backs to be bound the hands which had been armed for war, and realizing that their only hope lay in submission, flung themselves at the feet of a merciful Augustus, whose battles they well knew were often crowned by victory. When this business was dispatched, we showed similar resolution in defeating the Limigantes. Many were killed and others had to save themselves by taking refuge in the marshes. After this success, the moment had come to show mercy. We have forced the Limigantes to move to far distant regions where they can no longer constitute a threat to our people, and spared the lives of the greater number. As for the free Sarmatians, we have placed them under the rule of Xizias, who we believe will be devoted and loyal, rather than bring in a king from outside. We think it better to elevate him, and the fact that the king assigned to them is a man whom they have themselves previously chosen and accepted will give him a further title to respect. So a single campaign has won for us and for the state a fourfold advantage. First, we have inflicted punishment on a body of guilty brigands. Next, you will find an ample source of gain in the prisoners you have taken, and the spoils that the work of their own hands has won are a sufficient reward for brave men. We ourselves have sufficient wealth, in fact a great store of riches, if our toil and resolution have preserved the possessions of all intact. This, to the mind of a good ruler, is the happiest consequence of his success. Finally, as my personal share of the spoils, I am proud to have won for the second time the title of Sarmaticus, which your unanimous voice has conferred on me, and which, if I may say so without immodesty, is not undeserved. At the end of this speech, the audience displayed more than usual enthusiasm. They were encouraged to hope for further gain, and burst into triumphant shouts in praise of the emperor, calling God to witness, as their custom is, that Constantius was invincible. They then returned to their tents in high spirits, while the emperor was escorted back to his quarters. There he rested for 2 days and then returned to Sirmium like a conqueror, while the various units marched back to their stations assigned to them. Roman envoys to Persia return empty-handed. At this very time, Prosper, Spectatus, and Eustathius, who had been sent to Persia, had an audience of the king on his return to Ctesiphon. They delivered the emperor's letter and gifts, and proposed that peace should be concluded on the basis of the existing position. Mindful of their instructions, they made no concessions inconsistent with the interests and dignity of Rome, but insisted that a treaty of friendship should be based on the firm understanding that no steps would be taken to disturb the status of Armenia and Mesopotamia. After a long wait, they found the king inflexibly resolved not to conclude a peace unless the sovereignty of these regions was transferred to him, and returned from their mission unsuccessful. Later, Count Lucilian and Procopius, at that time a notary, was sent on the same errand to propose similar strong conditions. This was the Procopius who afterwards found himself constrained by harsh necessity to attempt an usurpation.